critics gained momentum. The acting Secretary of Labor nullified more than 2,000 deportation warrants, calling the evidence against the deportees flimsy. Palmer tried to focus public attention back on the Red Threat, claiming that he had received intelligence warning of a revolutionary upheaval on May 1st. When the day passed peacefully, Palmer was ridiculed for being an alarmist. A month later, a damning report by 12 prominent lawyers accused the Attorney General of utterly illegal acts which have struck at the foundation of American free institutions. Congress summoned him to Capitol Hill to defend his deportation raids.
At the end of it, Palmer is very frustrated. He saw the country call on him, demand him to take this hard line, and he did what he thought was his responsibility with the information he had before him. The hard part, though, is figuring out how you come up with something that addresses the threat, that doesn't at the same time do the collateral damage of sweeping up innocent people who've done nothing to deserve it.
Palmer still hoped he had enough support to win his party's presidential nomination. But when he arrived in San Francisco to appear before the delegates in July 1920, even his close friends regarded him as poor presidential material. The press wrote off the nation's fighting Quaker as the quaking fighter. By the time Palmer left the convention in defeat, hysteria-weary Americans were embracing the Republican nominee, Warren Harding. His campaign dismissed the radical threat and promised to return America to normalcy. On September 16, 1920, the stock market was having a bullish day. Reason for optimism after a bumpy summer. Inside the Morgan Bank, a partner was wrapping up a meeting with the owner of one of the country's largest mining operations about the latest round of strikes in the Pennsylvania coal fields. Across the street, government workers were busy transferring $1 billion in gold to the U.S. sub-treasury. A few minutes before noon, as lunchtime crowds began to fill Wall Street, a postal worker discovered 5 flyers stuffed inside a mailbox, just a short walk from the bank. As the bells of Trinity Church began to toll, he read the alarming words. Moments later, a violent blast rocked the financial district. It began with a flash, then a roar, followed by a force so powerful that skyscrapers 3 blocks north trembled from the impact. Fire-packed air smashed against buildings and burned through the lunch crowd, leaving devastation in its wake.
There's pandemonium everywhere. The brokers on the stock exchange think the glass dome atop the exchange is going to collapse. Trinity Church is shaken to its foundations. It's a terrifying scene.
When people came out from the trading floor, they could still see a mushroom cloud rising above Wall Street. It was hundreds of pounds of dynamite packed into a horse cart. When it went off, it just tore people in half.
Bodies mangled beyond description sprawled amidst the shattered glass. The remains of one man lay in front of the Morgan Bank. The building's pale granite walls stained with splotches of red.
All through the district were these little pieces of metal that were window weights, and they had been packed around the explosives. Many people died from lung injuries, from internal bleeding as these weights penetrated their internal organs.
Most of the dead were under the age of 30 and made a modest living serving the trading houses of Wall Street.
If you set a bomb at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets, the assumption was you were aiming for the biggest men of American capitalism, but that's not who this bombing hit at all. It really impacted ordinary people.
As news of the tragedy spread, stock exchanges across the country suspended business. Eager to minimize further damage to the nation's financial markets, Wall Street leaders moved quickly to reopen the New York Exchange for business the next day. Crews worked feverishly throughout the night to clean up the shattered glass and hose down the blood-stained streets.
Wall Street's answer to the bombing is to get back to what they described as business as usual and to put on a real show of defiance and strength.
Trading resumed at the New York Stock Exchange the next morning, as 100,000 people descended on the financial district to view the effects of the explosion. The mixed emotions of the day were on full display at noon, when a previously scheduled celebration of the signing of the Constitution began its patriotic exercises. They gathered at the spot where George Washington first took the oath of office, his unscathed statue just steps from the epicenter of the blast. The solemn crowd listened to a prayer for national safety and a speech calling for the capture and killing of the bombers, then joined together to sing a rousing rendition of the national anthem. Attorney General Palmer was quick to point out that he might have been able to prevent the attack if Congress hadn't slashed his budget in the backlash against his raids. He called for a new deportation campaign and vowed to ram a peacetime sedition bill through Congress.
On the day after the bombing, Palmer stood there. He said, "I warned you that something like this was going to happen, and here it is. We need more raids. We need more aggressive action against the people who clearly did this."
Palmer found wide support for his ideas in national business publications. But other voices were more cautious. By what means are we to face attempts to overthrow the established order by deeds of violence? One newspaper asked. There must be no yielding to fear.
A lot of people stepped up in that moment and said, "We'll get the person who set off the bomb on Wall Street. We will try them in court and we will send them to prison. But we don't need to go after entire groups of innocent people just because they share certain political opinions."
Finding the person who set off the bomb proved difficult. After sifting through tons of debris, investigators confirmed the bomb had been planted on a horse-drawn cart, but they were unable to identify the driver. With the followers of Luigi Galleani considered prime suspects, agents scoured Italian neighborhoods for leads. They traveled to Italy to track down the deported Galleani himself. Like many other suspected conspirators, he was nowhere to be found. Never entirely convinced the Bureau was on the right track, Hoover secretly sent agents to Russia to find proof that Lenin's communists had directed the attack. After 3 years, officials had little to show for their efforts, but an embarrassing string of false arrests. The trail had gone cold.
Probably the best theory that we have suggests that the bomb was actually set by a man named Mario Buda, who was, in fact, an Italian anarchist who moved in the circle around Luigi Galleani. And Buda's act was a protest against the arrests and deportations of Italian radicals as a whole.
Buda disappeared. He later turned up in Italy. People went and talked to him, etc. He never admitted anything like this. But again, you never know who to believe when you're talking to anarchists.
As anniversaries of the Wall Street bombing came and went, fewer Americans seemed to notice the case had not been solved.
It is the Roaring '20s. It is a time of triumphal celebration of Wall Street as an icon of American success and prosperity. And somehow this bombing just seems very quickly like the last gasp of an older, much more conflict-ridden age.
The Wall Street bombing is the culminating point of a long period of anti-capitalism that engaged American culture and politics and economic life for well more than half a century. But the bombing put an end to that. This act of terrorism was, rather than a kind of reveille for radicals, it was kind of their final last gasp.
By 1924, A. Mitchell Palmer, the man who had led the war against radicals in America, was no longer a political force. But his sweeping deportation campaigns had achieved many of their aims.
The heavy-handed tactics of the officials had really just scared the hell out of anyone who thought of joining the movement.
The Communist Party goes underground. The anarchist community never again has the kind of presence in American politics and culture that it did in the teens.
J. Edgar Hoover did his best to distance himself from the deportation raids. He claimed Palmer alone had been calling the shots. Hoover relied on his reputation as an invaluable manager to win a series of promotions, becoming the director of the Justice Department's Bureau of Investigation in 1924. He never lost his conviction that a violent left-wing conspiracy threatened the stability of the United States.
The Red Scare years remain really important to Hoover for the rest of his career. A lot of what he learns in those years he holds on to ideologically, but also strategically as well. If you're going to keep your files, if you're going to go after people, you want to kind of keep that quite close to the vest.
All the while he was promoting the Bureau as a modern crime-fighting organization, Hoover never stopped investigating people for their political ideas. He continued to add information to the secret files he created at the Radical Division, laying the groundwork for the agency's espionage efforts in the decades to come.
No case ever ends for the Federal Bureau of Investigation until it is solved and closed with the conviction of the guilty or the acquittal of the innocent.
Hoover was never able to convict anyone for the Wall Street bombing. The Bureau's last active investigation into the case was in